Okay, I think we can start. I will start with a few words in English. Afterwards, it will all be in Russian. First, like very few technical points. If you need a translation, the channels where you can listen to Russian and where you can listen to English is written there. Otherwise, I would ask everyone, if you have a laptop and may, for whatever reason, be logged in Zoom as well, please don't be logged in Zoom at the same time. That will cause technical problems. Yeah, my name is Lisa Good. I'm the head of the Russia program of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. And we are also supporting this lecture series or series of talks, Lonely Russia, which is organized with help from Ilya, from the Telegram channel Astranie Miri, and from the German Sakharov Foundation. It's actually already our second talk, so I suggest everyone to follow the talks that we're still gonna have. There will be a lot of more interesting talks. And the first one was actually also about the surveys of Public Sociology Lab and about the support of the war within the Russian population. And I think today we're gonna actually dive a bit deeper into that and talk a bit more about also dynamics within the elite and other topics. So I'm really excited about this. And before I give to our great moderation tonight, Anaid, I would ask to give the word shortly to Vera, who will also say a few words.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vera Riklin. I'm very happy to welcome all of you, those who are watching us online and those who are visiting us live in Berlin. Today, it's the second talk in the framework of the Lonely Russia series. If you're joining us on Zoom, today we're using two languages, English and Russian. If you need simultaneous interpretation, please choose the channel you are comfortable with. You need to click on the globe icon. Please choose either English or Russian. If you are watching us on YouTube, please ask your questions there in the comment sections. You're also welcome to contribute your questions here on Zoom. I'm very happy to pass my virtual mic to those present in the room. Hello, Vera. Thank you very much for returning the mic to us. Welcome to our conversation today. We are very happy to welcome you here. Today's event was born out of the discussion about today's speakers. They are Ilya Matveyev and Volodymyr Ishchenko. The discussion was about the Russian elite and their take on the war. And the question is whether Putin is acting in the interests of the ruling elites. The opinions of our speakers today are different. As far as I know, since the moment this discussion emerged, both Volodymyr and Ilya have new ideas on the matter, and today we'll be happy to develop this conversation. More experts are going to join us today. They are Oleg Zhuravlev and Alyona Yepifanova. Alyona Yepifanova, a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and Oleg Zhuravlev from the Bremen University. The invasion of Ukraine was the most significant event in Russian domestic politics since the collapse of the Soviet Union. For Putin, the war carried both risks and opportunities. The opportunities lie in eliminating the remains of organized opposition under the pretexts of war-related emergency, mobilizing the rally around the flag effect through propaganda. Of course, economic opportunities have to be taken into account, as the elimination of foreign competition in the domestic market could be seen as an advantage. However, the risks are significant. The compulsory mobilization led to spontaneous protests, and sanctions, of course, are to be mentioned. They destroyed business opportunities. Among the risks are threats to the Russian capital and to the Russian assets abroad. Before I pass the mic to our speakers today, I want to introduce them. So we have Volodymyr Ishchenko with us today, a political scientist from Ukraine, from Ost-Europa Institute, Freie University Berlin. His research was focused on protests, social movement, revolutions, radicalization, right and left politics, and civil society. We also have Ilya Matveyev with us today, politologist, member of the Public Sociology Laboratory. Ilya is interested in the Russian politics and political economy, the relationship between the government and the business, inequality, and ideological conflicts. Alena Epifanova, a political scientist, a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, Berlin. Alena studied political science at the Freie University in Berlin and the Altai State University in Russia in 2015. She received Bundestag's scholarship, IPS, and she is a graduate of the Frederick Naumann Foundation. Oleg Zhuravyov, a member of Public Sociology Laboratory. His research interest is the sociology of public movements, Marxism, pragmatic sociology, and event sociology. Volodymyr is going to begin our discussion today. In your article on Russia's war in Ukraine, you disagreed with Ilya's opinion on the fact that Putin is a psychopath. You disagreed that he is irrational in his action. Could you please unveil your arguments for our guests today?
Okay, right?
Well, sure. It depends on the.
Yeah, it's not that I can have any problems to speak my native language, but I think more people would understand if I speak in English. So yeah, thank you so much for this question. It's exactly to the point of what I was going to talk about. And yeah, I believe that the war is started in the collective class interests of the Russian ruling class. But before explaining this point, and fortunately, this argument is already published in an article on Jacobin, the website that you probably know, and also not only in English, but also in German version of Jacobin magazine, a little bit before. So yeah, I'll be necessarily very brief, but if you would be interested in my argument, you could read it in a more systematic and more extensive way. But first of all, yeah, the questions of rationality, because the very question of the discussion presupposes that the war is somehow irrational for the very people who actually started it, who planned it, and who now are making the most important decision. I believe it's indeed a quite probably wrong perception, but first of all, we need to speak about what exactly is rationality and in which ways we are thinking about this. So first of all, of course, yeah, mistakes are not necessarily irrational. I mean, we all understand that probably there was a huge miscalculation how this war was started, but it doesn't mean that the war was made by some irrational decision. And for example, making a wrong investment is a mistake, but making investment is actually rational behavior. But winning in a casino was not a mistake, but going into casino every week is probably a pretty irrational behavior and may even be a symptom of some psychological addiction. So Putin could make a mistake with starting an invasion, but it was still irrational behavior. Then there is a discussion about different kinds of rationalities. Maybe economic rationality, political rationality, ideological rationality. And some people would say that maybe Putin is simply like driven by ideological logic. He is a blind zealot. He like truly believes that Ukraine has no right to exist, and so that the main explanation for the war. And he said it in an article. And so why do we need any other explanation but the story about eternal historical Russian imperialism that just cannot live with the state Ukraine behind it? This explanation is actually pretty naive and idealistic, because even if we are making this point that the war was driven by ideological motives, we still need to have some material explanation how this ideology even appeared, how it's produced, how it's reproduced, how Putin was socialized into this ideology, and other people who are actually in his circle, and so on and so forth. So it's simply saying that Putin is a zealot, he's a nationalist fanatic, is just a very, very, very first step. Then you need to give a much bigger story behind that. And usually people don't have this story. Then speaking about rationality, there are different time periods also. There is a short-term rationality, mid-term, long-term, and something that may look like irrational in a short-term period may be actually rational in a mid-term period, or even in long-term period. And even when we are losing in the period of 1 or 2 years, we might be actually winning in a period of 10 years. And even if Russian oligarchs losing money now, they may be winning in a longer period, in a period of 10 years, and they could become actually consolidating their power. And there are also, again, the question of rationality. Which rationality? There are individual interests, there are collective interests, and even if some individual representatives of the elite are losing, but they as a class are winning. And finally, the other point that is quite often misunderstood, there is an assumption that even if this war, if this war wasn't started, everything would be okay in Russia. But that's actually a pretty questionable assumption, and all the troubles that are, of course, they are in the sharpest form after the start of the war, but there have been deep economic and political problems with the kind of the social economic order that existed in the post-Soviet Russia, and that would eventually came to a crisis this year or the next year. But precisely in order to overcome this crisis, this war could be one of the tools. So that's some of all this discussion about how we should actually understand rationality about the war. And in a very, like 5 minutes, I believe, or how much is left, the point is that if we are claiming that the war has been started in the interest of the Russian ruling class, the first point, of course, is to define this ruling class, and we need to understand the specificity of the post-Soviet ruling classes, the specificity of those people who started to dominate the economy of the post-Soviet states. And they could be called capitalists, but they did have some important differences from those capitalist classes that emerged, let's say, in Western Europe and in Northern America. And political scientists, sociologists, they quite often they use the concept of political capitalism that comes from Max Weber, but also developed by more recent researchers like Ivan Selenio, Branko Milanovic. The capitalists whose major competitive advantage is their selective benefits they receive from the state. And they cannot rely on the technological innovation, or at least to that extent that people like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg are relying on. Or on the other side, they cannot rely on the exploitation of extremely cheap labor that many capitalists in the third world are relying on. But their competitive advantage is actually the selective benefits from the state. And if they are this type of capitalists, now we could understand why Putin is talking so much about sovereignty, because if your major advantage is the state, you are fundamentally interested in marking this territory where nobody but your fraction of the capitalist class have a monopoly control. So when Putin is speaking about sovereignty, it's not some ideological zealotry. It's a reflection of the rational class interest. Now, then, in which conflict this ruling class has been in the post-Soviet societies? And I identify this conflict as a conflict between political capitalists on the one hand, and the alliance of the professional middle classes with transnational capital, politically organized in the NGOized professional civil societies. And why this conflict has emerged? Political capitalism has a fundamental problem. If you are basically stealing from the state, you cannot steal forever. And at some point, you need to move to some other model of capital accumulation. Otherwise, for example, developing some technological innovations, investing, reinvesting, expanding capital, or intensifying the labor exploitation. For different reasons, both these options were not optimal in the post-Soviet space. And another variant is you expand the pool where you can extract that rent that political capitalists are extracting. And with the stabilization of political regime by the leaders like Putin, the opportunities for rapacious expansion within Russia were contracting. The way forward was expansion beyond Russia. And what happens fundamentally should be understood as the continuation of the same process of destabilizing the relations within the post-Soviet ruling class, but not on the Russian scale, but on the larger post-Soviet scale. And the class forces that oppose this expansion process were the parts of the middle classes who were excluded from political capitalism and also the transnational capital. And we need to recall that the so-called anti-corruption agenda, precisely the agenda of eliminating the selective benefits for specific parts of the ruling class, was one of the most crucial agendas of all the Western-led integrationist projects. European Union, even NATO has a very important part which devoted to the fighting corruption. But anti-corruption is fundamentally against the interests of the political capitalists. So this is the fundamental structural class conflict that lies behind pretty much quite a big part of the post-Soviet politics, not only within Russia, but we also need to understand this conflict is cutting across the whole post-Soviet space. And why, going back to the wrong assumption that everything would be okay if the war would not be started, and why it is wrong. This conflict was escalating, and the problem was with the political organization of the interests of the political capitalists, sorry for this tautology. The kind of regimes established by Putin, but also by Lukashenko in Belarus, for example, personalistic, autocratic regimes are fundamentally fragile because they fundamentally meet the problem of succession. At some point, the leader needs to transfer power. And this decision is actually quite complicated because the successor should be smart enough to rule the state, but at the same time not that smart in order to remove your kind of like father too early. And this is one of the many, many, many dilemmas that autocratic rulers meet. And there is no political organization where this kind of successor could be socialized. For example, like a real political party, like, for example, exists in China, the Communist Party. That party did not exist anymore in the post-Soviet countries. There is no tradition of transfer of power, let's say from father to son, like in monarchy. There is no clear ideology which this another ruler should adhere to, and in which he was supposed to be socialized. So there are many problems, and precisely where the problem of power succession arises, there is a vulnerability point where the Maidan revolutions that we've seen in the post-Soviet space have the more opportunity to overthrow the leader. And right before the invasion, we've seen the escalation of the successful revolutions all around Russia, on the whole periphery. It's not only about Ukrainian revolutions, actually 3 in one country during the life of one generation, but also 3 revolutions in Kyrgyzstan, in Georgia, Armenia, uprising in Belarus, 2020, not successful, but still kind of like dangerous. And right before the invasion, an uprising in Kazakhstan, also kind of like defeated with Russian army, at least with some participation, even if symbolic. So that kind of political regimes that were established and that were organizing the class interests of Soviet political capitalists, they were coming to a crisis. And it's not exactly that this kind of revolutions created an existential threat to the ruling class as a whole. They would simply swap in one fraction of the class for another fraction of the same class. However, because of their counter-hegemonic deficiency, they were weakening the state. Instead of building stronger state institutions, they were weakening them, and they creating the point where the transnational capital could interfere more. And the future of what is happening with Ukrainian oligarchs now, not only because of the war, but also because of the various changes that happened after the Euromaidan revolution and the increasing dependency on the West in Ukraine, that they were the future that the Russian ruling class probably would not like to see. So coming to the very end of the argument, with starting the war, Putin is mitigating the threat. He is getting the opportunities to not only to attempt to restructure the world order with all this multipolarity thing, but also he is consolidating he's elevating the political organization of the Russian ruling class on a higher level. Not only political organization, with strengthening the political regime and making it less fragile, but also ideologically and also even economically. And now with the mobilization, many people are now expecting that, okay, Russians do not want to fight. They can just support the war only, like from the television. But there are apparent signs that Putin is starting to buy loyalty with quite huge money delivered to the mobilized soldiers, to the reconstruction of the recently annexed territories of Ukraine, and creating at least a part of the Russian society who would be directly benefiting from the war, and making the rule of the Russian ruling class more stable, and more kind of like firm. That's in the midterm. In the long term, there could be much more interesting processes that with the consolidation of the politics and political regime, with more ideological politics coming back, with more structuration of the society, of those who are benefiting from the war and those who are excluded from that and just suffering. There are opportunities for a fundamental change in the Russian politics up to the emergence of a much more organized, much more conscious, much more strategic opposition within the Russian society that may potentially lead a fundamentally different kind of revolution, a social revolution in Russia, maybe like what happened 100 years ago, and maybe Russia would sometimes be again the cradle of a new wave of social revolutions. At this point, I'll stop. Thanks.
Спасибо большое, Владимир. Владимир Ищенко, социолог.
Vladimir, thank you so much, sociologist from Ukraine. Before I give the floor to Ilya, you did not agree with Vladimir that Putin had a certain rationale in his actions. So can we ask this question to you again? So do you think Putin's actions are ideology, geopolitics, or something else? Ilya Matveyev, a political scientist. Thank you.
So, since Volodya spoke in English, I also have to speak in English. So I don't have a choice now. And also, I didn't want to structure my talk today as a polemic against Volodya. I actually wanted to kind of broaden the story a little bit. But then I felt that I disagree so strongly with what Volodya said, unfortunately, that I feel the need to respond to basically all of his points with my very strong disagreement. So I didn't want to do this, but now I also feel that I have no choice but to disagree with Volodya. Yes, I was provoked and had no choice than doing this. So first of all, there is this popular argument that the consequences could be irrational for a certain actor, but motives could be perfectly rational. So yes, the war is going badly for Putin and for the Kremlin, but he didn't know this from the start. And when he started the war, he was, acting rationally, right? So he was acting rationally, but he just didn't anticipate everything that will happen afterwards. But then there is a counter argument, right? Sometimes the consequences are so irrational and so completely divergent from the expectations, then this just in itself indicates that the motives were, at least in part, irrational. So if the war goes like this, then maybe Putin was irrational from the start, because it wasn't rocket science that it's going to be a huge catastrophe for Russia on every level, and for the regime as well. So I think that the very gap between expectations and reality demonstrates that ultimately there was a strong element of some kind of irrationality to Putin's actions, and this doesn't mean that he was like mad or a psychopath. It was just ideologically driven irrationality. So to me, this seems completely plausible, and I will explain why, right? So Volodya's second point, that Russia was not okay before the war. Again, complete disagree. So the fact is, in terms of the economy, the situation in Russia was, eons better than it is now. So Russian economy was stagnating. There were clear contradictions, but these contradictions were manageable, and there was nothing in the short or medium term that would indicate that Russian economy would collapse, or there would be some very serious problems and they require some kind of resolution. Also, a war is not a resolution of economic problems. The opposite, it only exacerbates them. So, and what happens with the Russian economy just demonstrates that the war cannot help the economy, Socially speaking, politically speaking, the opposition in Russia was already destroyed before the war. And we actually could see this in retrospect as a preparation for war. But still, the fact remains, in February, there was nothing left of organized opposition in Russia. There was nothing left of independent media. And the elites were perfectly consolidated around Putin. And basically, there were no open or even implicit contradictions that would indicate that some kind of drastic action is required, right? I mean, in that sense, yes, Russia was more or less okay. And it was not okay in terms of the living standards of the population, the authoritarianism, the lack of freedoms. But for Putin and for the Kremlin, there was no immediate problem in sight. And compared to what happens now, it was basically the golden age for the regime, I would say, the time before February. So that's the second thing. The third thing, the question of class. So again, strong disagree, unfortunately. So political capitalists, let's accept that the strongest faction of the Russian ruling class is these political capitalists. But the thing is, these political capitalists, the oligarchs, they didn't really have any real competitors before the war. It wasn't like they were threatened by some foreign competition, even in the long term, right? And they required some dramatic action to eliminate this competition. In fact, we know from the history of state-business relations in Russia that already in the 90s, even before Putin, this strongest domestic faction of capital managed to push out most of international competition in the spheres where these oligarchs, they had interest in doing business. So banking, for instance, already in the first half of the 90s, all foreign banks were pushed out of Russia without the possibility of seizing a significant market share. So the areas in which there was the presence of foreign capital were, let's say, peripheral to the oligarchs. And the oligarchs themselves benefited from cooperation with foreign capital because it was less competition and more profitable mutual dependence, I would say. And the final thing, so Volodya mentioned it as well, that yes, political capitalists, they prey on the state. But then the question is, where do the rents come from that they appropriate? So political capitalists, they take the money from the state, they steal essentially, they appropriate this money, but then where does the money come from? So the war destroys export markets for Russian resources, and this happens in the starkest way possible when Russia earns tens of billions of euros from exporting gas to Europe and to Germany, and now this is 100% impossible. So this whole export market is completely lost. In that sense, the size of the pie that could be divided between political capitalists is much smaller than it was before. It will be getting smaller. And yes, you could say that some international competition in the domestic market was eliminated, right? Because now Russian capital has no competitors inside the country. It's true. And I would concede that to some extent, this could be beneficial to some of these people, that there is no longer international competition at all. All those foreign companies left Russia. But Russian domestic market is not that interesting. It's small. It's, it's going to get smaller because of the crisis. And possibilities for integration into the global economy, they are much bigger than just, preying on Russian consumers. So Russian people cannot finance all those oligarchs. They need other export markets as well. They cannot just be parasites in one country. They need to be parasites everywhere. So, and this particular route was foreclosed for Russian capital. And in that sense, the nature of Russian capital is more complex than just preying on the state. These are actually transnational companies themselves. So Russian companies are transnational. They depend on foreign markets for capital, for exports, for technology, for labor to some extent. And all these facets of global interaction, they were kind of closed for Russian business. So in that sense, to me, it's kind of self-evident that Russian business in general, Russian capital in general, not only did it not gain anything from this war, it couldn't gain anything, from the start, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse until some kind of, the situation like in Iran happens, where yes, there is some capital in Iran, there is some business, but it's subordinated to a theocracy, and it's very weak in terms of, accumulation of capital. And the Iranian authorities said many times, so if we thought about the economy, then we wouldn't start this revolution in Iran, you know? So basically something like that happens when Putin started the war. If he thought about the economy, he wouldn't start this war. So the final thing, succession. So let's eliminate the business elites. Let's take them out of this equation. Let's focus on the political situation. And I can agree with Volodya that succession is the biggest problem for personalist autocracies like what we have in Russia. So it is the biggest problem for autocratic regimes. But the thing is, on this count as well, so when we had this discussion previously, I conceded that maybe there was something there. But now I think, no, I think Volodya is wrong on this count as well. So unfortunately, because let's imagine the situation before the war. So the path to succession was quite clear. And there's not going to be any kind of succession in the next 10 years or so. So Putin was going to stay in power until at least 2030. So at least until he's very old, maybe even after 2030. So for at least like 10 years. And legally, he opened the road to staying in power for 10 years with these constitutional amendments. And it's not like he had any real domestic opposition to that. Yes, he had Navalny, he had opposition movement, but it was crushed before the war, like I said, right? So he also had other options. He could nominate some other person if he wanted, because Putin always said, yes, I have the option of becoming president again in 2024, but I never said that I settled on this option. You know, you should just guess what my intentions are. So maybe I will nominate some other guy. Maybe I will go to the elections myself. You know, it's an open question. And it's true. He could choose between, you know, different people. So now, basically, if Putin, for some reason, loses power or, you know, is killed or dies, then this question of succession is irresolvable. Because the tensions between different groups of the political elite are so strong that one group will never accept another group. So let's say like Putin dies and then they try to nominate some kind of hardliner like Dmitry Medvedev. Dmitry Medvedev turned into this extreme hawk, right? But unfortunately, Dmitry Medvedev talks a lot, but he's not politically strong. And so he will be eaten alive by people who do not want to continue the war, who do not want to continue this aggressive policy, and who want to try to reintegrate in the world and keep, you know, stealing money and buying villas in nice European countries. So they will want to try and restore something to the pre-war state. And Medvedev would not be able to oppose that, right? The other scenario is that they will nominate some softliner, right? Some dovish person who will try to, you know, to give in to all the demands, to stop the war, to completely kind of retrench and on every demand, right? On everything that Putin did. So this is possible. But then again, there is a camp of hardliners, including Medvedev, and they will try to prevent this nomination. They will say, no, so we fought for all that, and now you want to give all this, you want to declare defeat, but we are not ready to declare defeat. So there's going to be an infighting between at least these two particular factions within the political elite. And so the question of succession is now more difficult than before, and as difficult as ever for Russia. So I personally do not see any way for the saving of this regime without Putin in power. Before the war, it was possible to imagine Putinism without Putin, actually. And there were several options. You know, he could nominate different people. And this was like possible. But now I don't see that it's possible. I think that the end of Putin means the end of Putinism. And so to finish this unfortunately extremely polemical intervention, so I would say that Putin clearly had very strong political survival instinct before. So the obvious example is these constitutional amendments in 2020. So people thought that he will choose the Kazakhstan scenario, where you have the president and Nazarbayev is someone else, not the president, right? It's a kind of triumvirate. And a lot of people thought that it could be, a sensible scenario for Putin. But then Putin said, of course not. I'm going to be president forever. And people thought, why did he make such a, unnecessarily kind of brutal decision when he could do something more complex like Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan? And then Nazarbayev was, as you all know, ousted from power in this internal coup / uprising. And now Nur-Sultan is renamed in Astana again. So a complete defeat for Nazarbayev clan. And Putin somehow kind of anticipated the possibility of this scenario and stuck with the simplest, the most, the simplest roads to saving power, right? So he has this great instinct for survival. But the war demonstrates that his instinct failed. It might be the first time when his instinct truly failed, and starting this war demonstrates that there is a strong element of ideologically motivated kind of irrational decision in that. So, thank you.
Спасибо, Илья. Я бы хотела задать
Thank you very much, Ilya. Now I would like to turn to Alyona Yepifanova, a political scientist. Alyona, before 2014, Russia strengthened the position of the Russian business in the post-Soviet state. I mean, the aggressive politics, international politics, did not inhibit the development of business. Now we see a threat to the stability of the economic system. What paths of development did Putin count on blitzkrieg that never happened, that would not harm the economy, or a long-term perspective, a long-term development in the country's economy? Good evening, everyone. This is a very interesting question indeed. Actually, I don't really know what happens in Vladimir Putin's head. I focus on IT, politics, internet politics. And I think your question is definitely connected to the model of the development of the Russian economy. Under Vladimir Putin, it started on a very curious journey, taking into account extremely high prices for oil and gas. And a lot of people in Russia believed that actually these years were because of Vladimir Putin, not because of the resource economy. But further years showed that in the times of crisis, resource economy is not very efficient. In 2008, 2009, when the crisis came into Russia and the government had to invest billions of rubles into the Russian economy, GDP of Russia fell by 8%, if I'm not mistaken, in those years. A lot of peoples in the elites, including Dmitry Medvedev, who then was seen as the person to hope for by the West. These years led to the understanding that the model had to change. The stake was made on IT, innovations, new technologies. And indeed, looking back, we see that there were a lot of innovative national programs launched in those years. A lot of research and development projects were launched on the state level, including Skolkovo, which you may have heard about. So there was this idea of creating the Russian Silicon Valley. It became strong in those years precisely. But also, it became clear that leaving resource economy would mean diversifying the Russian economy, which may be a danger for the regime. When Vladimir Putin returned to power in 2012, at first, in his rhetoric, he said that the economy had to be smart, not based on resources, but very soon he seized the politics of modernization after the Arab Spring, after seeing the middle class rallying on the streets of Moscow. and other cities in Russia. He realized that diversifying economy would mean diversifying the capital too, and it could lead to the rise of non-controllable economic agents and their entrance to the political sphere. And the projects that were launched become frozen. Putin returns to the idea of sovereignty, which we're going to discuss today, I think. The ruling class is closed on itself. No reforms had been launched yet, but the agenda changed very clearly. The new track meant the less the dependence of the Russian economy on international technologies, the fewer tech and IT projects that are not controlled by the state, the better. The clearer the political structure, the clearer the economical structure of the state. The years to come, including 2014, were the decisive ones. I would say that the political debates began in 2004 after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. So the concepts we are discussing today appeared back then, including sovereignty, for example. But in 2014, after sanctions against Russia were introduced and they hit the Russian economy quite strongly, especially the IT sector, this sovereignty agenda, decoupling agenda, the agenda of decoupling from the West, first of all, in the financial institutions, and secondly, in high tech, in IT. This agenda is manifested in many doctrines, including the doctrine of the cybersecurity in 2000s. Russia's security starts to depend on cybersecurity. The idea is that Russia is dependent so long as it is dependent on technologies, which are mostly Western. So this track to decouple from the Western technologies began in 2011 and was strengthened in 2014. We also see the strengthening of the security forces in those years. These are the forces that were selling the fear to Vladimir Putin, claiming that dependence is a danger, dependence is a risk. So the idea was that as long as the Russian economy or the Russian state depend on the Western technology or is included into international logistics, the state is at risk. I think you're going to talk about sovereignty in the minutes to come. Mr. Krasner uses the term dependence on sovereignty. When the Kremlin felt that they could not control the money flow, the IT flow, and all the attempts to create their own technologies to replace the importation, saw a lot of investment and a lot of state corporations made a lot of money out of it, including oligarchs that are close to the Kremlin, the loyal ones. So we saw that in those years, when a lot of sanctions were imposed on Russia, when global IT companies left the Russian market, we saw that Russia did not have any IT sovereignty. And all those money invested into Skolkovo, into Rostec, into the Russian IT, all that investment, all that money was in vain. And as for the main question of today, the balance of risks and opportunities, I would call it a miscalculation again. Yes, a war can be launched. And yes, indeed, a war can squeeze the Western companies out of Russia, but it's all based on the premise that we have everything we need and it's all safe and secure. It's all double checked by the security, by the state security. It's all working fine. But in fact, as we see, nothing works properly. And the proclaimed independence from importation is non-existent. We see a lot of dependence on the technologies produced mostly by the US, which are sanctioned now. I think I will pause here. So your question was about risks and opportunities, and I think that, yes, at the beginning, the idea was that a war or an armed conflict may cause sanctions, but there was the feeling of security. There was a feeling that Russia had its safety bag and maybe could even make money out of it. I think there was a miscalculation of risk at the beginning. I think the stake was made on collaboration with China and on the domestic solutions, which turned out to be non-functional. And maybe one last point I want to make. As for the so-called sovereign Russian internet, which the Kremlin has been working on since 2009, proves to be non-existent too. The Russian internet is still incorporated into the global internet. And I would say that the state success in this sphere is very arguable. So I would say that there are more risks here than opportunities. Thank you very much, Oleg. I would like to turn to you, Oleg Zhuravlev, a social scientist. Vladimir Ishchenko in the debate said that the war is a good chance for political, social, and economical transformations. So, with all the proper global planning, how could the Kremlin make such miscalculations? I think that although Ilya and Vladimir disagree with each other, they are united by the fact that this decision, which was made by the sovereign elite. Volodymyr said and emphasized that even Putin acts in the interest of large business, he does not take into account the short-term interest. Basically, his actions lead to losses short-term. Ilya says that Putin was leaning on ideological motivations, and that meant that he launched the war because of his ideology. So here we see the idea of the elite, which is sovereign, which is autonomous from business, from the society. How did it come about? We all know that in mid-2000s, and Ilya wrote a lot about it, Putin eliminated business from decision-making, although acted in the interest of business. It's called Bonapartism. I act in the interest of the ruling class, but I don't allow any representative of that class to participate in decision-making. As Alona has just said, still, diversifying economy could lead to the voice of business to be meaningful again, and for representatives of business to claim their interest in decision-making. We said that elite back then was already independent from the society. Elite was making decision and was feeding the people. The people did not interfere with the politics. But then we saw the protests of 2011, 2012. We saw with our own eyes that a big part of the Russian society wanted to engage in politics, and that means that we need to work on our sovereignty again, to become independent from the society yet again. from the society and business. This power is embodied in how Putin understands sovereignty and how he speaks about it. I will quote him. And he protects this sovereignty in the war. Quote, do the Ukrainians understand that their country is just a colony? Ukraine was losing its sovereignty because of the actions of the West, end of quote. So basically, Putin is saying that the Ukrainians may not even understand the fact that they don't have any sovereignty. What does it say? It says that Putin understands sovereignty as the rights, as the power, as the state of the elites. And it's a very important theoretical question, because we know that historically, the source of sovereignty, but by the way, it's written in the Constitution of the Russian Federation, are the people of the country. So if Putin says that the Ukrainians don't even understand that they are deprived of sovereignty, he hints at the fact that they may not understand what sovereignty is, because it's all about elites. And here we go back to medieval times, when the sovereign was the person who could launch wars, or who could represent his or her, his own interests in any actions. That those protests and rallies that emerged in 2011, 2012, the movement for transparent elections was very curious. Our polls, our surveys suggest that people who went out into the streets back then were not opposed to the current regime, to the current authorities. They stated that they were different from the power. So it's not like they're opposed to the power. We are different. We are honest. We have our own world. They are robbers. We're just different. When we analyzed the protests in Ukraine, we saw the same thing when we asked the protesters in our interviews after the Euromaidan, do you want to become politicians? They said, no, politics is bad. We have our own politics. If the government does something wrongly, we will just protest again. So, you see, these are the people who do not want to take power, but who rather say, we are the power. Do you see us? We'll come again. What does Putin do in return? In return, Putin could mobilize a different part of the society which is loyal to him and use it to get rid of the protesters. Ilya Matveyev and I published an article about it. Putin chooses a completely different track. He is being politicized, but he doesn't use any social groups. He performs the annexation of Crimea, he supports the separatists in Donbass, and he starts to articulate his own political agenda, which is conservative, which is anti-orange revolution. But it is not about mobilizing the social sectors that are loyal to him. He is closed from the society even more. So first the protesters claim their autonomy from the elites, but this elite is counter-politicized, but it does not use other groups. It becomes angry, politicized, but it uses only itself in search of power. So sovereignty, in the understanding of Putin, means independence of other sovereignties, and only big countries may be sovereign, like the United States of America, or sovereignty from its own society. So basically, it's about emancipation from the society, from both the protesters and the supporters. Putin tries to be popular among the conservative parts of the society, but he does not mobilize these people. The same happens to ideology. We see that gradually a conservative militarist language becomes a kind of a code of the Russian elite. We are against the West, and our children are going to study here in Russia. We are against the LGBTQ plus community. This is the language that they use to stand out. This is the language of the community. But if we talk to the people who are neutral or who support the war, we will see that they don't share any of these ideological points. Well, if we don't take into account just a handful of radicalists. So everybody else says, well, we support the war because we don't engage with the politics, and we truly believe that Putin understands politics better than we do. He must have had certain reasons to start the war. Or they say, of course, we understand the Ukrainians. Of course, if you are bombed, you are going to resist. That's natural. And the supporters of the war, in saying this, basically claim that they don't share Putin's ideology that Ukraine is not a state and there is no nation of the Ukrainians. When they say that the Ukrainians have the right to resist, by saying this, they presuppose that the Ukrainians exist as a nation.
И в плане идеологии элита и
As regards ideology, the elites and the society live in parallel worlds. They do not have a connection, even through ideology. The state of this sovereign elite has its own rhetoric. Just recently, I watched a film called Salvation Union. It's about the Russian decabrists who acted in the first quarter of the 19th century. So there was a dialogue of one of the revolutionaries talking to an official of the state. The official says, you know what, we are the same because we have the same goals, but your methods are criminal. And I find it quite curious. This atomized elite says that their goals are criminal. Putin and his friends are turning into some kind of revolutionaries because they are acting through criminal methods. As we know from theory, at a certain point, society gains an autonomy from the state, the people is formed, and all of a sudden, this constituent power emerges. So that was the time when people emerges as the source of sovereign power. And it is possible that the people act through this so-called illegal or criminal methods because it overthrows the government. Now we see the opposite. We see that the elites are turning into revolutionaries themselves, and they are crossing a line of legality. So if we understand that Putin sees sovereignty as the emancipation of the elites from the people, and of course it's really hard to study elites in Russia because they are all very closed up. But what we can see now, that the Russian elites are not trying to engage the people, they're trying to isolate themselves. This understanding of sovereignty as autonomy of elites enables us to respond to a question that everybody would like to hear a reply to. So some people see Putin as a cynical person or He could be seen as a maniac and someone who believes in traditional values and puts them above everything else. Now the elites are saying the following: yes, we are thieves, we are cynical, but who but us could defend sovereignty? Definitely not the people, not business circles, because business cannot decide on anything besides its own interests. Us, the elites, we need to defend our sovereignty. That's why we got all our wealth and power. And now when we are sovereign, when we are free from the people, we can start the war based on our ideological positions, and we can defend the ruling class the way we need and the way we deem necessary. But the further we'll find out in the debate between Volodya and Ilya. Thank you so much, Oleg. Oh, my colleagues have already told me that we can give the mic to the audience. Are there any questions to our speakers? Please raise your hands. Please ask your question. Let's wait so that you can get the mic. Thank you so much for your presentations. That was really interesting. I have two questions, one to Ilya Matveyev and the other to Oleg Zhurlavov. Ilya, you said that Putin has a political survival instinct, but maybe he committed a fatal error going to this war. So why did he do it? Did he have bad information coming? What happened? Should we try to find answers maybe in people who surround Putin? And my question to Oleg Zhurlavov, you said that the Russian society doesn't even want to engage in politics, and it sort of consented to this division between the elites and the people. Do you see any prospects for the Russian people to take an active part in political life? Vladimir said that there was such an opportunity. So what's your opinion about that? Thank you. Well, no one knows the answer to this question, but I'm thinking about this. I think maybe Oleg is right in his theory. It seems that Putin's been so isolated from the people that he's stopped being able to read the signals that he receives from Ukraine and from his own country. And the other reason is his conviction that people in Ukraine and Russia are incapable of doing something on their own without the behest of some foreign forces. So he received this backlash in Ukraine that he didn't expect. He thought that people in Ukraine wouldn't fight because he doesn't believe in people. So he thought that violence is the only method and it's the only effective method. And I think this is something that created a distorted understanding that he had of the situation in Ukraine. Perry Anderson, a very well-known Marxist theoretician, in 2015, he wrote an article about the war in 2014. And there he said that the Kremlin and Putin sort of missed all post-colonial movements, as if they haven't seen them. They couldn't realize that these movements could be very strong. the Russian elites live in a kind of world where people is always passive. I think this deficient philosophy is to blame. It made him close his eyes to common sense. It's obvious that an invasion into a huge country regarding the military, regarding its economy and the way its military is trained would lead to a catastrophe. But Putin underestimated the fact that the nation could respond. And I think that's what can explain his failure. Thank you so much for the question. Definitely, my thesis is that the people did not only consent to the separation of elites, but it also got very depoliticized. And even when people take to the streets, they are not ready to claim that they have the right to power. They tend to be more content about creating the world where they can communicate with each other. We studied protests of 2011, 2012, but the following protest as well. And we learned that with time, protesters started claiming power. Why? One of the answers is that Navalny, who turned into a leader of the process of the protests, changed his rhetoric and agenda from the liberal populist to the left populist. Navalny said that from now on they criticized not only corruption, but those who stole the money from you. If we compare people who went to protest in 2011 and later, their rhetorics changed. If in 2011, they said that we're not like those in power, we're better. In 2017, they said the elites are taking something away from us. But this change in rhetoric of the Russian protest was halted by the offense on the opposition that Putin undertook in 2021. Though we can see that there are some successful political campaigns, like the electoral campaign of Mikhail Lobanov to the Russian parliament in 2020. We can see that there is local activism in Russia. It's always been strong, but following the protests of 2011-2012, local activists also turned to the opposition. So they're interested not only in those municipal local issues, but they see that the Russian elites are in agreement with the Russian construction companies, for instance. So we can see that these local activists are becoming more and more politicized. And then maybe finally the Russian society could learn more and could claim power finally. Thank you so much. Maybe there are other questions from the audience. Yes, please. Hello, I have a question to Volodymyr. I'm not sure that I understand why political capitalists are interested in territorial expansion. There could be other way to consolidate the elites. there is no need to have a puppet regime in Ukraine. So how is this political capitalist logic linked to the Russian urge to expand its territory? The expansion could be explained by the key contradictions of political capitalism, because one has to expand the resources that they can borrow it from. You could steal something from your competitors, or you could steal something from the budget. But when that is evened out, the rent decreases. So either the elites have to take their approach, they have to find new sources of rent, and the former USSR countries are those where this rent could be extracted from. That's why Putin is more interested in the so-called New Russia, the east of Ukraine, because it's more industrialized. And the Western Ukraine doesn't interest him so much. Of course, there could be other ideological explanations, but I think that there is also economic rationality. So what interests him in Ukraine most, and what could become the source of the rent for political capitalism? So this is where the expansion comes from. Thank you. Thank you so much. We have time for one more question. Anastasia, can you see a person from the audience?
Thank you very much for those insights. I have a question to Mr. Matveyev. You mentioned that the question of succession, if something would happen to the system right now under Putin, would be a problem in an infight between hardliners, who are very visible right now, and softliners. Where are they? Are they still part of the elites? Do they still have access? How do they cope with the situation?
So I'll answer in English as well. Again, we don't really know what's going on in the elite. So it can only be speculation with some, evidence, with some justification. But my sense is that most of the elite are softliners, actually. They're still completely disoriented by what's happening. They couldn't imagine half a year ago that it will come to this, to mobilization, to complete revamping of everything that exists in the country. So I think that hardliners are visible, yes, but softliners, even during this televised National Security Council meeting right before the war, we saw some hesitation in these people. Yeah, they were all, but not only they were trembling visibly, but they were also like trying to convey to Putin that, like, maybe there are some diplomatic avenues left. Maybe there are, these negotiations, they might bear some fruit at some point. Maybe we shouldn't need. So I think that even within the security services, people like Naryshkin, I don't think that he's like a hardliner. So, and he's the leader of the intelligence service, Russian intelligence service. So I actually think that, and of course, all of the businessmen would dream of ending this war, like all of the oligarchs, all of the state corporations, everyone would, for them, this would be a path to survival, some kind of survival. So I think that the hardliners are quite isolated, right? So these are kind of paramilitary style units. So Prigozhin, he is not part of the army, so he's just kind of, he tries to strengthen his position by going all in terms of this war. Kadyrov, the same thing. He's a kind of, outside of the system, so he has his own private army, or what's left of it now. So they're hardliners, but most of the others, they're softliners, actually. So I would say that, and then they will be immediately visible. If Putin dies at the moment, immediately we will see all the softliners, and they will say, of course, now we finally can say that we didn't want this war, from the start. So I think there will be like a stream of admissions like that. I suspect that, yeah.
Спасибо, Илья. Владимир, возможно, у вас
Ilya,
есть...
thank you so much. Vladimir, maybe you also have a comment on that as regards Ilya's criticism. Somebody told me that maybe you wanted to respond to him.
На что?
What should I answer? Sorry, I didn't really get your question. Maybe you want to answer Ilya's criticism? I mean, maybe you would like to say something to his opinion. Well, we'll turn just into polemics, kind of, into an argument. How much time do we have left? We have some time left, around 5-10 minutes. Got you. I'd love to comment on the other argument that have just unveiled itself about the isolation of the elites from the society, and that the decision about the war was taken in complete isolation from the world, what is happening in the world now. I think when you're saying this, you're missing something. You're missing the change that is happening in the political regime. I mean, the relationship between the government and the society. And I think you're missing the current return of the influence of the Russian society and how they influence the dynamics of the war. And I'm talking about the part of the society that you may not be sympathetic about. Ilya said that Putin had an idea that the war would go extremely well because Ukraine won't resist, because their people cannot resist. They are not a subject, a political subject. But I want to draw attention to the fact that now, when the war went differently from what he imagined, now he counts on the Russians to feel that this is not Putin's war. This is the war for Russia. At least this is how Putin tries to show it. So basically, the Russian state is at risk, supposedly. It's not a war with Ukraine. We are not even fighting NATO. We are fighting the whole West. And it is turning now, through the propaganda of some ideologists, is that we are getting ready for another great patriotic war. So basically, it will be a war for our sovereignty. And here we should not even discuss whether it relates to reality. We should discuss the ideology of the state. Have they slept through the anti-colonial movement? Well, they have woken up now. Most part of Putin's talk about the annexation of the east of Ukraine is based on decolonialism, that Russia is waging a decolonialist war against the Western imperialists. Even if before the war the regime used passivity, depoliticization of the society, and it is a great gap between the government and the society, now we see that the imperative of the war that is going really hard push the government to enforce changes. And these changes influence the war itself. Some of the moves that can be analyzed as irrational ones, including probably yesterday's shelling of the Ukrainian infrastructure all around the territory of Ukraine. It hardly makes any sense from the strategic point of view, but instead it makes a lot of sense as a kind of an inspiration for the Russian society, which is now tired of shameful defeats, the Crimean Bridge, Kherson, Kharkiv, and the Russian society is looking for a great answer. So this is that great, that massive answer. And this shows that actually the society does influence Putin, who you think is completely isolated. So we must see that the war is changing the Russian politics, and the war is changing the society itself, making it more radical. Before the invasion, Putin did not have any real social foundation he could use. The war is creating it now. People who are ideologically invested in victory are becoming influential. There are people who are earning money from the war, from all the state orders and through all the changes introduced in the economy, in the production. So what we see is the emergence of a clear social group, which may not be majority, but still it's a clear social group, which is the foundation of the changing political regime. And midterm, this regime may become more consolidated and more stable than before. Thank you very much, Vladimir. Dear audience, thank you very much for your questions. They are great, and we will be happy to take another one. Okay. Then we will wrap up our discussion here, and we are very happy to invite you to our cocktails reception here at the entrance. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you very much for your attention.